Welcome to Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Join Dr. David Ramadan and Schar School experts as they engage in thought-provoking conversations with elected officials, policymakers, and thought leaders. Listen for in-depth discussions on policies, politics, governance, and career pathways, all designed to elevate your perspectives and expand your mind.
Welcome to another episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives, the official podcast of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Today, we turn our attention to the Ukraine, a nation still fighting for its survival nearly 3 years into a brutal, grinding war. Joining me as co-host for this episode is my colleague, Professor Ellen Laipson, Director of the International Security Program and the Center for Security Policy Studies here at the Schar School. She joined GMU after a distinguished 25 years career in government and as president of the Stimson Center. Her last post in the U.S. government was vice chair of the National Intelligence Council. She also served as the State Department Policy Planning Staff, the National Security Council staff, and the Congressional Research Service. And our guest, Mary McAuliffe, a freelance journalist and video producer covering conflict zones. She has embedded with Ukrainian military units and frontline medics to document the realities of war, specializing in visual storytelling. Mary focuses on the human impact of conflict through in-depth reporting, interviews, and cinematography. Prior to her work in Ukraine, she worked as a Jerusalem-based correspondent for an international news channels. Together, we'll explore what daily life looks like in Ukraine today, the suffering, the resilience, and the stories that rarely make it beyond the battlefield headlines. Mary, Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Mary, thank you for the courage and for sharing these insights from the front lines of Ukraine. And Ellen, thank you for helping us understand the broader policy context of this conflict. This episode reminds me that behind every geopolitical headline are real people, fighting, surviving, and hoping for peace. As you may know, I was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and I have lived the civil war, but it's been few years. Mary, take us there. What does this life looks like? What does it feel like today in Ukraine for everyday Ukrainian?
Well, I think some people also forget that Ukraine is a very large country. When they think about Ukraine, they think, oh, the war is everywhere. So where I live, it's very much close to the front line. So we can get into that in a minute. But you can also go into Kyiv, you can go into Lviv and some other big cities in Ukraine where they're just beautiful villages and the Carpathian Mountains in the west that feel completely untouched by this war whatsoever until you start to talk to the people who maybe tell you the stories of people they know who are fighting on the front lines. But it really does feel like any other European city. There are bars open, restaurants open, people just going about their daily life. Of course, also in Kyiv and some of these cities, you may have air raid sirens. But for the most part, many people now, almost 4 years into this war, are really trying their best to just continue on with their lives because they don't really have any choice. They can't live in a bunker. So it really has become quite routine. So you will see people out on the streets, sitting, having coffee, sitting at cafes, even if air raid sirens are going off, but it's sort of the chances that you have to take rather than if you're in Kyiv, for example, living somewhere, knowing there's air raid sirens, going to a bunker, or just maybe taking the odds to say that things are going to be okay, or I'm just not going to live most of my life in fear. You really have this atmosphere with most Ukrainians where life is going on. And even where I live, which is about 20 kilometers from the front line, we still have cafes, you still have families going out, you still have people who are riding their bikes and just kids who are playing in the playground, even though we have a playground right outside the apartment we live in now. You'll hear very large strikes nearby. The kids will stop for a second and they go right back to the routine, which I think for most Americans to see this would be completely unfathomable, but they're just so used to it at this point. So they really are doing their best to just try and keep on keeping on.
You're bringing out old memories for me, and you've been back and forth. What struck you the most when you returned to the country time after time after time? And what changed? What have you seen over the last 3 years as far from the start of the war until where we are today?
So I first went in 2023, I was there right on the 1-year anniversary of the war. And it was a very completely different Ukraine. I went to Kyiv and it very much felt like a ghost town. There were a few restaurants open, but I would be the only person sitting at a cafe. I'd be the only person sitting at a restaurant. Maybe one other people come in. It was very much a different atmosphere. When I came back, which would have been January of this year, very completely different. There were a lot of people who were out like normal. It felt like a completely different city, a completely different country. I think at this part in the war, because it had been over a year and a half since I had last been there, that they had just sort of gotten fed up with the situation and had sort of accepted the reality that this war was going to happen and continue for a long time. So many people who had left and maybe gone to Poland or to other parts of the world had returned in that time period. So the numbers of Ukrainians had certainly returned. There had a lot of people returning to various different cities. When it comes to the front in the east and Donbass area, it's also a completely different situation. The war changed significantly. We used to live 10 kilometers from Donetsk city. So we lived well within Russian artillery range, which was quite close. But for the most part, we lived there. Things were okay. We were driving back and forth if we needed to go to supermarkets in other cities. Pokrovsk was the city we went to, which tragically now, at the center of most headlines now. Now, the area which you can live has shrunk significantly, not just because the Donbass, the territory, has been significantly encroached on by the Russian forces, but also you can't live in areas where we used to be able to live, where the army used to be able to operate and live and have their bases in, because there were drones, but there weren't FPV drones like they have now. Now it's a complete minefield. So within 20 kilometers of the front line, so this line of operations has been completely pushed back of where people can live, where it's safe for them to live. So everything has felt much more condensed into a smaller area. And there are now 3 cities remaining in Donetsk, which is also just an insane number every time I think about it.
I remember in my childhood in Beirut, we ran away for hours at some points, for days at different times, for months at different times. And then there was one time that we ran away to Alexandria in Egypt, and we lived there for 3 years before we returned. So I can relate to this people going away for a day or a month or 3 or a year or 2 and then come back, and this migration back and forth, which definitely has an economic cost that is beyond belief, but it also has an emotional cost. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Mm-hmm. I think the hardest part, for a lot of people, again, like a lot of my experience is going to focus on like the eastern Donbass region, just because that's where I've lived. I pass through these cities, but I don't spend significant time there. There those who are in the West or even in Kyiv, like they're able to return to their homes. Maybe they went to Poland, maybe they went abroad. They're able to come back. It's hard in our area because these people who have to leave in our area, they know very well that they're not coming back to this area, because the way the Russians have been able to advance very quickly in this area, it's a very different mentality than if you lived in other parts of Ukraine, than if you live in one of these areas that Putin has declared now belong to Ukraine. So for them, they're leaving what they can. In the last house I lived in, there were still many belongings of the family and things that were left behind, like a wedding dress hanging in the closet and these kinds of. And so emotionally, that feels a lot harder. For example, like when we left our house, I'm not Ukrainian. Of course, it's not my house. I only lived there 6 months, but I grow attached to things easily. So I can only imagine what it's like to actually live there. I felt very emotional because I know when I left for the last time, I would not be stepping foot in this house again. And there's a possibility that no Ukrainian steps foot in this house again if Russia gets the way that it wants and continues to maintain control of this territory. Because once they occupy it, it just becomes occupied and there's no going back to that area.
Yep. Ellen, let's take this to a policy discussion. The microphone is yours.
Yep. Thanks, David. And thanks, Mary. So, we're sitting in a policy school, and of course, people tend to think about what's the U.S. doing and how our policies are received. And since you've worked closely with being embedded with Ukrainian military units, maybe to just start with a simple question, is it your impression that what's the mood among soldiers? Sometimes we hear stories of difficulty recruiting. So give us a snapshot, if you can, of, is there a feeling that the war, that it's stalemate, or that maybe things will get, that every time Zelensky comes out into the West, there's conversations about, if you'd only give me the equipment I need, we can turn this in our favor. But other military analysts would say, there hasn't been a lot of movement in the line. So in your interactions with, people in the military, and I realize people in the capital city may want to characterize the status of the war differently, but when you're close to the front line, do people feel that kind of fatalistic? Do they think that, this is sort of never ending? Or do they think that there might be some chance of ending this one way or the other.
Yeah. I would say a lot of them don't really hold a lot of hopes for negotiations. When I'm in Ukraine, I come back to the States, people want to talk about, what's happening with Zelensky and Trump. What are they discussing in the White House? What military aid packages, what negotiations are happening? These kind of discussions are so far from the minds of the people that I actually live with because they don't hold a lot of hopes, one, for negotiations. I think they are very aware of what negotiation Putin wants. And that would be the area, the unit I live with, they have fought and lived in Donbass, in Donetsk region for the past 4 years. And Putin continues to say the only negotiated settlement they would have would include that Russia would control this area. What that means practically for them is everything that they have fought and lived and suffered through for the past 4 years, in the end, Russia will win because they'll get this territory. So for them, it's very hard for them to listen to these negotiations and hear politicians talk about what this actually means for them on the ground when maybe to Americans or just people abroad, it's like, this is just a line drawn in the sand. For them, this is a line that they have defended and fought and died and suffered for so many years. And it's really hard to overestimate how much of a toll that has taken on them. And so it's not an optimistic atmosphere in any atmosphere. I mean, I will never forget the moment when Trump and Zelensky had that big blowout in the White House back in March or February earlier this year, and watching the soldiers that I live with, watching that on like their tiny little tablet and just seeing the looks on their faces. And as an American, just feeling, I don't even know how I can put it into words because I also want to keep apolitical, but it was just so distressing for them to see because they really had high hopes that something could change. They really did believe in this rhetoric. And I think that was the moment where it shifted for a lot of them, where they stopped really giving any hope that something could change on the ground. Because for them, they felt very disrespected by the American president and by de facto the American people, by how this was allowed to happen, how their leader was treated like this in such a meeting so highly televised for them. It was quite embarrassing for them as well as embarrassing for me, just as an American, was no connection to it, but just...
Yeah, no, for sure. But, this attachment to territory is real. It's universal. Many other cultures have some of the same issues. Think of the people in Gaza. So I'm curious do you know whether the soldiers that you're working with or that you're, living close by, do they come from all over Ukraine or do they tend to be recruited from the area itself? Because I'm wondering about that attachment to those particular segments. It's roughly 20% of total Ukrainian territory. I wonder whether there's the larger principle of the, sovereignty and integrity of the borders of the country, but there may also be some soldiers are more attached to those particular communities than others. But are people deployed from different parts of the country, or they tend to be local?
So this could also open like a whole other can of worms. Nobody who I live with, we have one new soldier. He was a conscript, so he was basically rounded up by the government and recruitment office in recent months, and he joined a unit. But everybody else, all of them have been fighting since the beginning days of the war. None of them are from Donetsk Oblast. None of them are from Luhansk. None of them are from any of these eastern territories. They all come from the west or Dnipro or Kyiv. They all come from areas that are very far detached from it. And there is also a lot of animosity among them. This is why I say it might open a can of worms. They don't necessarily like being in the Donbass. They have a lot of issues with the people there. The people treat them far differently than people do in other parts of the region. They have very different perspectives of the military. They have very different ways they treat the military there. And it's widely known that also there are a lot of Russian sympathizers in the Donbass. So they have been fighting in this area. They've lived in this area, and they have a lot of hostility between them and the people because a lot of the people who they live defending don't want them there. And they see them as the problem, as they're the reason why there is war in the area. And so they call them like the shtunai, which is the waiting people, which essentially is people who believe that the Russian government is going to come in and everything will be better for them because the Donbass people themselves, there are many who have issues with the Ukrainian government. They feel very much that they have been neglected for years. This is an area that's very far from the Ukrainian government. They have issues with resources, infrastructure. And in general, there's a big disconnect between the people who live in Donbass and the people who live in the rest of Ukraine. So none of them are really emotionally connected to the people of the Donbass, but they still see it as part of Ukraine. So because it is part of their country as a whole, even if many of the people don't actually want them there defending them, they still see it as very much like their patriotic mission to remain to be there.
Now, that's an important distinction. I mean, you think of it, the morale of the soldiers, while they may not be personally attached or culturally affiliated with the people who live here, they can still grasp the larger concept of the country of Ukraine and that, there's some larger purpose to it. But I can imagine for some of them, if they're stuck in these World War I style, trenches, they may say, this isn't land that I feel so attached to. So that's really interesting. I don't know if they avoid talking politics, but do you sense that, just in terms of outside actors, do you feel that Europe is the more reliable partner for them now? Do they ever make observations about, we can really trust the Europeans, the Americans are less predictable, less reliable these days? I know that we have this proclivity to think that everything America does is so important, but in reality, we're not the only actor, and we've been very restrained about no boots on the ground. This was true for Biden and for Trump, that we do not want to be a combatant. We will help Ukraine, and obviously the level of support varies, but any impressions of, do they feel more connected to Europe? Is the U.S. kind of a very far away and complicated player? Any impressions on their views on that?
Yeah. I would say they very much respect the Europeans. They know Europe has done a lot for them. They're very grateful for it. We'll constantly see European machines and vehicles and, heavy machines out on the streets, and they're definitely grateful for it. But I would say, despite everything that happens in Washington, beyond the political side of it, they do very much respect the Americans. And every time they get anything that's American made, it does hold a certain weight within them. Mm-hmm. And again, maybe they heighten this because I'm an American, so they're saying it to me. But we recently got, in the unit that I work with, they got these American machines. It's called a Max Pro. It's basically like a souped up pickup truck, but it's a very, very heavy machine. That was a huge morale booster for them on the ground because it really did change a lot of their defense. It allowed them to go to areas that had become too dangerous to go in because they can't take tanks under these areas. So while they might have issues and they might have been saddened and upset by everything that happens in the White House, they do still hold so much regard for anything that's American military made, but we'll get random things from just volunteers or that they collect and, it'll say some American, like, oh, well, this is American. So there is definitely a level of respect there. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily one versus the other. I think they're grateful for everybody who's helped them. That's something they tell me constantly. And I will try and ask them, well, how do you feel about this? I mean, you saw they're not going to give them these missiles. How do you feel? And they'll say, they're very diplomatic. They say, well, we're just so grateful for everything that we have received, because they truly are.
Yeah. So back to the recruitment issue, and then I'll pass the baton back to David. We do hear about, recruitment difficulties, or that at least some young Ukrainians young professionals, people who had no military experience, managed to get out of the country to avoid the war, maybe, or just to, for their own professional requirements. Do you see older people? There's some talk of whether you see people who are kind of past what would be considered maximum efficient fighting age. So you see, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds in the unit in which you're affiliated?
Mm-hmm. In the unit that I live in, out of maybe, let's say, 10 people, there are 3 under the age of 35, and I'm one of them.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
So
the vast majority of all the young soldiers, it was told to me once by one soldier that all of the young, physically fit, capable commanders were burned out very early in the war. So within the first year of the war, a lot of them will lament that there were a lot of maybe lack of tactics or lack of not knowing what was going on. And there was a lot of capable men who were wasted during this period of just the initial days of the chaos and confusion, initial months of the invasion. And at this point, sadly, yes, everybody who's in our unit is probably 40 plus with a few exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. David, you want to pick up the baton now?
Yeah, let's stick to that human side of the story. Mm-hmm. Soldiers, medics, civilians, you spend time with all of them. What stories stand out? What capture both the pain and the resilience? Can you share a couple?
Every day I feel like I see the resilience, because sometimes I look at them and I just don't know how they keep going so many years in. It just feels like every day there's a new problem. Every day they lose more men, they lose more equipment. I think even the first day that I lived with this unit, which was back in May of 2023, I was working with a medic and she'd taken me on, and we ended up living with a group of soldiers who took us in. So there were 10 people staying in one house. We were sharing like a bunk with maybe 6 other people. One of them was the soldier of this unit. And in the middle of the night, we had no idea what was going on. We had no idea how things worked there. I was very new. This is my first time actually spending significant time with soldiers. One of the soldiers got up in the middle of the night at like 3 a.m., so we woke up the next morning, thinking something catastrophic had happened, that to get called out of the bed in the middle of the night. We later found out weeks later that every single night he'd been waking up in the dead of night so they could take advantage of what they call gray light. So it's sort of like before dawn where like the sun is just beginning to set, but you don't really have sunlight out. And every single day he was digging in muck and mud looking for the bodies of two of the men who had died under his command. To us, when we first heard this, we thought, wow, he's such a dedicated commander. He's really taking it personally because to be digging in this area, it's also on the zero line. So he's putting his life in danger for the bodies of soldiers, which I didn't understand for a long time, is why would he sacrifice himself for men who had already fallen and put his own life at danger? But then you find out later that in order for the family to get compensated for the soldier, if you die, the family gets a certain amount of compensation, but they need the actual body in order to get the compensation. So this commander was taking it upon himself, risking his life every single day to be digging through human remains, mud, and just really horrible situation under Russian artillery fire, within range of Russian weapons, just so that the family of two men who fell under his command could get compensation. And I think about it a lot often because I think that speaks a lot to the resilience of the Ukrainians and how deeply they care about their men, their country, and people they've never met, but the families of the men, that they will go out of their way to do everything they can for them. And there's so many stories like that of people who I've met since then.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Certainly are things that we don't think of in our everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
How about civilians a little bit off of the front lines? The human spirit. What are you seeing there? I mean, people are going to schools every day, right? Universities are probably running as well. And and how do they balance that?
Well, it depends where you live. So in our area, it's all distance learning. Kids aren't in school anymore. But if they're a bit further outside the area, they will be going to schools. But even in the last village that we lived in, I mean, the last month there, we were under FPV range. So it was just constant drone attacks there. And one was on our street, very near to us. And, you know, we had like an impact. I went out with like my med kit, my camera to go see what the situation was. And you see all the neighbors who are just there. You had like a group of 8 neighbors trying to corral the cat and get him back inside. And everybody just immediately coming out to help each other. And then everybody went back to their daily life as if nothing has happened. And then a couple hours later, I went like on my normal walk around the block at sunset. And people were out there just as normal. You know, families were talking to each other, like all the grandmothers were on their regular routine. Kids were riding their bike. And I don't know if, I've never seen it in America, but it just felt uniquely Ukrainian to me. I mean, I've also lived in Israel where you have similar, but it's something about the Ukrainians. They will really just not let anything keep them down, and whether that's civilians or the military, and they will really try to do everything possible to pretend this isn't happening or acknowledge it's happening, but see how can we continue moving on. So the civilians, I have so much respect for them, and they, even in the area where we live, I don't understand why there are civilians who are still living there with their families and their children, but for so many of them, they just say, this is my home, I've lived here forever, and they're not going to let somebody come in and force me from it. Whether or not that's the smart idea, whether it's something I would do, probably not. But you do have to admire the courage and determination to say, I will not be forced from my home.
I do. And I'm recalling that when I was a kid, growing up in Beirut, and had to share similar stories of what you're reflecting on now. Yes, we lived day to day. And yes, it was a matter of, can we get bread for tomorrow or not? It was a daily thing. Or is there going to be milk or not? By the way, the milk was never fresh. I mean, the first time I've ever had fresh milk was when I was 19 and immigrated to the United States. So it's always powdered milk because there was no fresh milk in Beirut during the war. But finding the day-to-day, sleeping overnight in front of a bakery so you can get bread in the morning, taking my dad's car as a teenager without a license, or there are no license, people killing each other, but pulling up that car and waiting in line all night long so you can get 2 gallons of rationed gas. I've lived all of that, but I do remember distinctly that I didn't let that stop me from dreaming for the future and thinking about the future. How are Ukrainians thinking about the future today? I know they are. I can guarantee it without being there. But how are they thinking, and what are they thinking for the future today?
Something I do think about often, because I talk a lot about the guys and the soldiers that I live with. And I've been noticing recently, they talk a lot about the past. They talk a lot about, we'll sit around at the end of the day, even if somebody's out working, we'll wait until maybe it's 10:30, but like we will sit and we'll have dinner together. And so most of the times they talk about the situation on the ground now. They talk about their past. They talk about the jobs they used to have, the kids, what they used to do. But I have noticed a shocking lack of the absence of what the future will hold. And I tried also asking the question of what do you think you'll do after, they'll maybe talk about a job they used to have working as a tractor repairman. I say, do you plan to, when the war's over, will you go back to that? And they'll say something like, oh, I don't know what will be in the future. Like there's this inability, I think, for a lot of them to really think about the future. And maybe because it is, in Lebanon, Israel, you had these short bouts of conflict and then things would end, unless you lived in Gaza or the West Bank where things went on forever. But you had these short and things went on. For them, I think they have lived constantly for almost 4 years in this state of living away from their families, away from their wives, away from their children. And for them, I think it's really hard to conceptualize what is going to happen after the war, not just in terms of actual on the ground, what their job will be, but also going back and imagining actually living with their families again. And it's always a very sensitive subject. So every time I've tried to ask, what do you think will happen in the future? Well, let's, even if it's just simple as, what if there's a ceasefire in the Donbass today? What's going to happen then? Even months or two from now, it's hard for them to think like that. And I don't know if it's also maybe a distinctly Ukrainian idea where it's something they just think a little bit differently when it comes to planning, or, they all grew up in the Soviet era. So I do think that has a big impact on a lot of the way that they think when it comes to day to day and enduring and planning for the future and planning for what you're going to have. That I really don't hear them talk a lot about the future. And it is something that I do think about often because I stopped really trying to ask because I understood maybe it's a subject for them that just brings too much pain because they so much want an end to this war where they can think of a future where the war isn't going on. But I think they've been in it for so long, day in and day out, that it's really hard for them to conceptualize what that actually means and what it will look like.
And I can see that. It's not easy. I mean, there were two types of people during the war. When I was there in Lebanon, there are those that thought of the war as what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Mm-hmm. And you survive and you say, I can survive anything. And I subscribe to that mentality. But there are a few that, no, the war destroyed them, even if it didn't kill them or hurt them physically, the war literally destroyed their mentality, destroyed their feeling, destroyed their future, and because they just gave in and gave up. So I do hope that there'll be more Ukrainian that subscribe to the first one, that what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. Ellen, close us out with a little discussion about journalism.
Sure. So I'm really interested, Mary, if you could tell us about the journalist project that you have by staying with this one unit. Is your goal to create a documentary of this particular unit, or do you sometimes want to go and compare this unit to other units, or what's the level? And was it hard to get the Ukrainian military's permission to, see them up close the way you are? Can you tell us a little bit about the environment, why you chose this environment, or what the journalistic objective is? And, because we've read about, we've seen journalists embed with American military units, but I presume it's quite unusual or interesting to be embedded in a foreign military's day-to-day life. So I would love to hear more about that, if you can tell us.
I don't think there's other journalists who have taken the approach I have. And if so, I would love to meet them because I would have a lot of questions. Just to give some background. So I worked in Tel Aviv in Israel, based in Jerusalem for a long time. We moved back to the States, and at the time I had covered the war significantly from afar. I was a diplomatic correspondent. So I was constantly talking about what Israel's role would be in this war, at the time with Prime Minister Bennett and Zelensky. There was a lot of discussions about how Israel could help. Would they help? Would they give the Iron Dome? So my day in and day out for months at a time was dealing with the Ukrainian war. But I was very far removed from the war itself. My channel didn't want to send me on the ground, too expensive, too much, too dangerous, what have you. So when I left the channel, I decided to myself I just wanted to go there because I'd spent so much time talking about it. But I understand that seeing things from afar, seeing pictures, talking, there's only a small aspect of the war I could really understand. So I went essentially knowing nobody, and just through luck of it, I ended up meeting this American medic traveling along with somebody who's delivering aid to her. And I thought, well, it's an amazing story. This American firebrand living with a bunch of Ukrainian soldiers. So I originally wanted to do a project about American volunteers in Ukraine because I know there's also a lot of American fighters who joined Foreign Legion, who have joined military units. And the idea of Americans joining a foreign war effort just was very interesting to me because, of course, everybody has different motives, how they could sacrifice so much for a country that isn't theirs and they have no connection to at the end of the day. So I started working with her and just because I was living with her, we ended up with this unit. And I sort of became very attached to the idea of this unit of they come from all different places of Ukraine. They have all different backgrounds. They speak different languages. They speak different dialects. And they've all come rust together because of this war. And I was just very much enamored by watching them interact on a daily basis with the problems they face. There was just so much that we in America didn't know and could not know. But just by the fact that I was there and happened to be in the right place at the right time, that they grew to trust me. So they would interact a bit differently than if a journalist came in. Because most journalists will come in, they'll come in for a day, they'll come in for a couple hours in these areas, and then they'll leave, or they'll come with a big security convoy and armored vehicles and things like this. And that doesn't really breed for truly getting to underknow a situation. So by the fact that I was there, and I was doing live news from my channel, so I wasn't really filming them day in and day out. Over time, they grew to trust me, and I am accredited with the Ukrainian Armed Forces. But most of the work I do there is simply by the fact that they know me and they trust me, that I'm able to film with them. So I'm in a very unique position, but it's also a sensitive position because they let me film with them, but only under the condition that I now can't publish anything. So I don't publish anything about the unit, the name of my unit, where we live, anything like that until they're no longer there. So the documentary will be something that'll be happening a couple years from now.
Interesting. Yeah. And do you see, journalists from other parts of the world? I mean, does China send journalists? Do you see Indian journalists? I mean, how much attention is the Ukraine war getting? And it's probably dropped off by now, I would think. It does look like it's, because it's been kind of stable and a little bit frustrating for so long. I wonder if international news media are just less interested in spending money to get journalists there. Yeah.
They definitely are. And I will say that's one of the main reasons why I came back. So I spent 5 months there, my first stint there, and I came back to rest, recuperate for a month before I planned to continue my project. Then war in Israel happened. My channel asked me to come back. And I remember standing on the hill in Sderot, which is right on the Israel-Gaza border, and you're looking over the hills. And it was packed with journalists from every single nation, speaking every single language. And I just couldn't help notice the discrepancy between war in Israel and war in Ukraine, and the amount of coverage it got, the amount of attention it got, even the way that you could tell the story, the way you were able to interact with the soldiers on the ground there. It was very frustrating for me as a journalist. And I had a lot of struggles with that because I very much wanted my job and I enjoy seeing the human side of pieces. It's something I always liked about being a correspondent. You get to talk to people, you get to meet people who you would have never met before. And that atmosphere at the time, it was a very sterile environment. You stood on a hill, you got statements from the IDF, you got reports from Palestinian media, and that was sort of the extent of what you really could do. We couldn't go inside Gaza. That for me was very frustrating, coming from living on the front lines with a unit and being very much exposed and very much aware of everything that was going on. You don't see many Ukrainians in the Donbass now. It is a big area, so it's possible they're here or there, but most of them, they'll come in for a couple hours at a time and then they'll go back to Kyiv. And if you go to Kyiv, you can walk around the central square. Most of the journalists will be in this one square outside the cathedral. You'll recognize the background. But for the most part, it's nothing compared to the coverage of Israel and nothing compared to the coverage. Even at the beginning days of the war, I don't think there was anywhere near the same amount of coverage, in my opinion.
So do you feel like you can't finish your documentary until the war is over? Or when will you know that you've got a story to tell and that you've accepted the condition that you won't release until they're gone? But do you feel like it's kind of open-ended for you now?
Yes. Well, it's a question my family asks often because they always ask for an end date. But it's hard to know.
I may interject here for a second. By family, I'm sure the listeners have noticed the last name. Mary McAuliffe is the daughter of our former governor and our colleague, the distinguished professor of practice at the Schar School, Governor McAuliffe. I know for a fact the governor, Mrs. McAuliffe, would love to have her home for good.
So it's hard for me to answer the question because for me, though, I also feel very much attached. Like my story right now is about this specific brigade, who's an infantry brigade, and they've been fighting in the Donbass. So I've chronicled them living in one house, this house, having to move areas, what their new areas of operations are. I don't really see a scenario outside the Donbass where it makes sense in terms of my movie. And that's just how I see it. And I don't know why. I'm sure the war is going to continue probably past this area. But for me, their story is very much about the defense of Donbass because, I mean, there's also so much to tell in that story. They've operated in so many different areas, every major, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, every single major operation that has happened in the Donbass, their brigade has been a part of that. If that brigade is no longer In the Donbass, I'm not sure where the story goes from there. So for me, as I see it, my main end dates, let's say war in Donbass ends tomorrow, that could be the end of my filming there.
Well,
but I don't think that will happen, so I'm not really
wish you
holding my breath.
safety and success in your project. It sounds like a very intense experience.
Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much again for your courage. Thank you for sharing these stories from the front lines. Ellen, thank you again for putting this into a context of policy for us. Mary, would love to have you back when it's over, and hopefully you can share with us some of the footage at that point. If there's anything that we can help with from the Schar School while you are at the front line, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. This episode, I hope, will get to our listeners, to our students, with the message that behind every conflict, there are people that are fighting, people that are surviving, people are hoping for peace. And even though people like Mary are not sharing their story today, there is a story, and hopefully that story will be shared in the future. You can listen to this and all of our episodes on schar.gmu.edu/podcast or wherever you get your podcast. I'm Dr. David Ramadan. This has been Policy and Governance Perspectives. Until next time, stay engaged and stay informed. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Policy and Governance Perspectives. We truly appreciate you joining us for these important discussions featuring voices from across the Schar School. For more information and to explore our archive of past episodes, please visit schar.gmu.edu/podcast. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you next time.